I was 6 years old the first time I looked for my mother in a room full of parents and didn't find her. It was my kindergarten open house, the kind of event where small plastic chairs are arranged in a semicircle and every child is supposed to stand up and say one true thing about themselves while their parents beam from the audience. I remember scanning the rows of faces, mothers in work blazers who'd left the office early, fathers with cameras hanging around their necks, a grandmother in the back row fanning herself with a paper program, and not finding the one face I was looking for. My teacher, Mrs. Alden, crouched down beside me afterward and asked, gently, if everything was all right. "My mom's just busy," I told her, the way I would tell dozens of teachers over the following 12 years, the sentence worn smooth from repetition, like a stone rubbed soft by a river. My name is Piper Hayes, and this is the story of every empty seat my mother ever left behind, and the one person who eventually filled it, not by replacing her, but by proving that a chair doesn't have to stay empty just because the person who's supposed to sit in it never learned how. My mother, Diane, was not a cruel woman. I want to say that clearly, at the start, because this isn't a story about villains. She worked 2 jobs for most of my childhood, days at a dry cleaner's counter, evenings ringing up groceries at the store 2 towns over, because my father had left when I was 3 and support checks arrived, when they arrived at all, late and thin. She was tired in a way that had settled so deep into her bones it had become simply who she was, the way a river wears a groove into stone until the groove becomes the riverbed itself. But tired or not, the pattern held, year after year, parent-teacher conferences, science fairs, the Christmas pageant where I played a shepherd and stood very still holding a broomstick with a stuffed sheep tied to it, the 4th grade spelling bee where I came in second and looked immediately for her face in the crowd and found, instead, my neighbor Mrs. Castellano, who'd agreed to come just in case. Every time, the same phone call the night before. "Piper, honey, I'm so sorry, I got called in," or "the Petersons need me to close, I can't get anyone to cover," or, worst of all, sometimes no call at all, just an absence that announced itself in the empty chair, the empty seat, the space where a mother was supposed to be. I stopped telling her about the events after a while. Not out of cruelty, out of a strange, early instinct towards self-preservation that I didn't have words for yet. If I didn't tell her, I couldn't be disappointed by her not showing up. If I didn't hope, I couldn't be let down. I got very good, over the years, at going to things alone. At sitting through parent-teacher conferences where the teacher's eyes would drift, again and again, to the door, waiting for a parent who wasn't coming, until eventually they'd stop looking and just talk to me instead, 12 years old, answering questions meant for an adult, because there was no adult in the room to answer them. By middle school, I had built myself into a particular kind of person, the girl who didn't need anyone. I got good grades, not because anyone pushed me to, but because good grades were something I could control entirely on my own, without depending on a single other person showing up for me. I remember a conversation with my best friend at the time, a girl named Josephine, who lived 2 streets over in a house that always smelled like something baking. "Doesn't it bother you," she asked once, as we walked home from school, "that your mom never comes to stuff?" "I don't really think about it," I lied. "My mom drives me crazy," Josephine said, "but she's always there, you know? Even when I wish she wasn't." I didn't say anything to that. What was there to say? I couldn't imagine a mother who was so present she became irritating. Mine was a mother defined entirely by her absence, a shape cut out of my life in the exact size and outline of the woman who was supposed to fill it. At home, Diane and I existed in a strange, functional orbit around each other. She left cash on the counter for school lunches. She signed permission slips at the kitchen table at 11 at night, half asleep, without reading them. she asked, most evenings, how was school, and I gave her the same one-word answer, fine, because the honest answer, lonely, mostly, and I gave a presentation today that nobody watched, felt too heavy to hand to a woman who was already carrying more than her shoulders could hold. There was one night, when I was 12, that I've never forgotten. I'd made the honor roll, the actual honor roll, framed on a certificate, my name printed in careful calligraphy, and there was a small ceremony after school where parents were invited to watch their children walk across a little stage and shake the principal's hand. I told my mother about it 3 days in advance, an unusual choice for me by then, but some stubborn, hopeful part of me thought, surely this one. Surely she'll come for this one. The night before, she came home late, smelling like the dry cleaner's chemical tang, and I asked her, as casually as I could manage, are you still coming tomorrow? To the honor roll thing? She rubbed her eyes. What time is it again? 2:30, I said. Right after school lets out. I have a shift at 3, she said. I can maybe come for the very beginning, if I leave right after. She didn't come at all. I stood on that little stage, shook the principal's hand, looked out at the audience out of habit rather than hope by that point, and found, as always, an empty chair where she should have been. I didn't cry that night. I'd stopped crying about it years before. I just went to my room, closed the door, and did my homework, because homework was reliable in a way mothers apparently were not. There is one memory from that year I have never been able to set down easily, so I've saved it for its own telling. I had been taking piano lessons for 2 years by then, paid for by a scholarship program at the community center that covered lessons for kids whose families couldn't otherwise afford them. My teacher, a patient older man named Mr. Okafor, told me before the spring recital that I had real hands for the instrument, and I held on to that sentence the way you hold on to a coin you plan to spend on something important. I practiced for weeks. I chose a piece by Chopin, a nocturne far too difficult for someone my age, but Mr. Okafor let me try it anyway because he said ambition should occasionally outrun ability, that this was how a person actually grew. I told my mother about the recital a full month in advance. I even circled the date on the calendar that hung by our refrigerator, the one place I knew she'd see it every single day, a small, hopeful act of persistence. The night of the recital, I sat backstage in the community center's little auditorium, hands cold with nerves, peering through a gap in the curtain at the rows of folding chairs filling with parents. I found my mother's usual absence almost immediately. No calendar circle, it turned out, could compete with a cancelled shift request denied at the last minute. I played anyway. I remember very little of the piece itself, only the strange, floating sensation of performing something difficult and beautiful for an audience where, once again, the one face I was looking for simply wasn't there. I hit every note I'd practiced. I made one small mistake in the third measure from the end, a stumble no one but Mr. Okafor probably noticed, and I remember feeling, in that instant, a bone-deep loneliness that had nothing to do with the mistake and everything to do with the empty seat in the third row where I'd hoped, despite everything, she might finally be sitting. Afterward, in the lobby, Mr. Okafor found me by the punch bowl, looking, I imagine, exactly like a child who'd just realized no one had come to watch her. You played beautifully, he said. Truly. Where's your family tonight? My mom couldn't make it, I said, the familiar sentence sliding out smooth and practiced. He didn't say anything right away. He just nodded, slowly, and then said something I've carried with me since. Talent like yours deserves an audience, Piper. Someday you'll find the people who make sure you get one. I didn't understand, at 10 years old, how prophetic that sentence would turn out to be. I only understood, walking home that night under a sky just beginning to darken, that some part of me had quietly decided to stop expecting an audience at all, a decision that would hold, mostly unshaken, until the fall of 8th grade, when a new English teacher started looking at me the way people look at things they intend to keep. Everything changed, slowly and then all at once, in the fall of 8th grade, when I was assigned to Mrs. Eleanor Frost's English class. Mrs. Frost was in her 50s, silver-haired, with reading glasses she wore on a beaded chain and a habit of sitting on the edge of her desk instead of behind it when she talked, like the space between teacher and student was something she refused to accept as fixed. She had a laugh that filled a room and an unnerving way of looking directly at you when she asked a question, like your answer actually mattered to her. I noticed her noticing me before I understood why. She'd linger near my desk during independent reading time. She'd write long comments in the margins of my essays, not just grades, but actual sentences, things like "this observation is sharper than you realize. Say more here or you have a good ear for dialogue." Have you ever tried writing your own stories? Nobody had ever written me a sentence like that before. One afternoon in October, she asked me to stay after class. I remember the particular fear that request produced in me, the automatic assumption, bred by years of being the kid whose mother never showed up, that I was in trouble, that something was wrong, that I'd have to explain, again, why there was no one available to call. Instead, Mrs. Frost handed me back an essay with a grade of A+ at the top and said, "Piper, I run a small writing group after school on Thursdays. Just a handful of students. I think you'd fit right in." "I don't know," I said, my automatic response to most invitations by then, a reflex built from years of not wanting to be disappointed by my own hope. "Just try it once," she said. "If you hate it, you never have to come back." I went. I didn't hate it. Over the following months, that Thursday writing group became the fixed point around which my whole week rotated. Mrs. Frost had a gift for making 4 teenagers feel like the most interesting people in the building. She asked real questions and waited, patiently, for real answers. She remembered small details from weeks earlier, a mention of a book I liked, an offhand comment about wanting to visit the ocean someday, and brought them up again later, proof that she'd actually been listening, that I'd registered as a real person in someone else's memory. One Thursday in December, she asked the group to write about family. The other 3 students wrote about siblings, about family vacations, about grandmothers who made good cookies. I sat staring at my blank page for the better part of 20 minutes before I finally wrote, in a small, careful hand, about empty chairs. I didn't share it aloud that day. Mrs. Frost collected the pages at the end, as she always did, to read and return with comments the following week. The next Thursday, she asked me to stay a few minutes after the others left. "Piper," she said, holding my pages, "this is one of the most honest things I've ever read from a student your age." She paused. "Is this really what your life looks like? Every event, alone?" I felt something in my throat tighten, the old instinct to deflect, to say it's fine, I don't really think about it. But something about the quiet, steady way she was looking at me made the lie feel impossible to produce. "Pretty much," I said instead. "My mom works a lot." "That doesn't mean it doesn't hurt," Mrs. Frost said. Not a question. A statement, offered like a hand extended across a gap I hadn't realized anyone else could see. I cried, right there in the empty classroom, for the first time in years over the subject of my mother. Mrs. Frost didn't rush to fix it or fill the silence with reassurance. She just sat with me while I cried, handed me a tissue from a box she apparently kept for exactly this purpose, and said, when I'd finally quieted, "You are not too much, Piper. Whatever your mother's reasons are for missing things, they are not a verdict on your worth." I need you to hear that. I didn't fully believe her that day. But I filed the sentence away somewhere, and over the following years, I took it out and looked at it again and again, the way you'd examine a stone you'd found on a beach, turning it in the light until you finally understood its shape. From that year forward, Mrs. Frost became something I didn't have a name for yet, not a mother, not quite a friend, something new that existing words didn't fully cover. She started showing up. Not instead of my mother, not as a replacement announced with any fanfare, but simply, present, at things my mother wasn't. My freshman year science fair, where my volcano model erupted spectacularly and only 3 judges and Mrs. Frost, standing near the back with her arms crossed and a proud, quiet smile, actually saw it happen. My sophomore year, when I made the school newspaper's editorial board and there was a small reception afterward that my mother forgot about entirely, Mrs. Frost was there, holding a paper cup of lemonade, telling the advisor that my last article on the school's outdated library funding was the sharpest thing that papers published in years. There was a smaller moment too, one I've never told anyone about, that fall of freshman year. I'd caught a bad flu, bad enough to keep me home from school for 4 days, and my mother, working double shifts to cover a coworker's maternity leave, could only check on me by phone between customers. On the 3rd day, feverish and miserable and completely alone in our small apartment, there was a knock at the door. It was Mrs. Frost, holding a grocery bag with soup, crackers, and a get-well card signed by the entire writing group. "I heard you were out sick," she said, when I opened the door in my pajamas, startled and a little embarrassed. I wasn't going to just let that go unremarked. "You didn't have to do this," I said, my voice thick with congestion and something else besides. "I know," she said, setting the bag on the counter with the easy familiarity of someone who'd been in that kitchen before, though she hadn't. "That's rather the point, Piper." I remember asking her once, my junior year, why she kept showing up. It felt like a fragile question, one I was almost afraid to ask in case the honest answer made the whole arrangement disappear. "Why do you keep coming to things?" I asked her, after a debate tournament where I'd placed second and looked out, instinctively still, for a mother's face that wasn't there, and found Mrs. Frost's instead, clapping harder than anyone else in the room. She considered the question seriously, the way she considered everything. "Because someone should," she finally said. "And because, Piper, you are worth showing up for." I don't understand why that's been so hard for the people whose job it was to figure that out. But it doesn't cost me anything to be the person who does. "It's not nothing," I said. "It's not nothing to you, I mean. You have your own life. Your own family." "My children are grown," she said. "My husband passed 6 years ago. I have plenty of Thursday afternoons and Saturday mornings with nothing pressing in them." "You're not taking something from me, Piper. You're one of the better things I get to spend my time on." I didn't cry in front of her that time. I was getting more practiced at holding things together in public by then, but I cried in the car afterward, in the passenger seat of the ancient sedan I drove myself around in because there was rarely anyone else available to drive me, feeling something in my chest crack open in a way that hurt and healed at the same time. There were harder moments too, ones that tested whatever new thing was growing between us. My mother found out, my junior year, about the writing group, about the science fair, about the small trail of events where another woman had apparently been standing in the audience where she should have been. "Who is this teacher?" my mother asked one night, an unfamiliar edge in her voice, something that might have been jealousy, or guilt wearing jealousy's clothes. I've never been fully sure which. "Mrs. Frost," I said. She comes to things. Since I was in 8th grade. You didn't think to mention that to me?" I remember the anger that rose in me then, sudden and sharp, 12 years of empty chairs finally finding a voice. Why would I mention it? You were never there to ask. My mother's face did something complicated, flinched, then hardened, then softened again, all in the space of a few seconds. That's not fair, Piper. Isn't it? I said. I told you about the honor roll ceremony 3 days ahead of time. You didn't come. I told you about the spelling bee. You didn't come. I stopped telling you about things because it hurt less than watching you not show up, and somewhere in all that, someone else started showing up instead, and now you want to be upset about it? She didn't have an answer for that. She left the kitchen, and I heard her bedroom door close softly down the hall, and neither of us brought it up again for a long time. But something had shifted, some old unspoken agreement broken open into the daylight where it couldn't be quietly ignored anymore. I want to pause here and be fair to my mother, because this isn't a story meant to flatten her into a single failure repeated for 12 years. There were things I didn't understand then that I understand better now, looking back as an adult myself. I learned, much later, that my mother had grown up in a house with even less warmth than the one she gave me, a father who worked 3 jobs and a mother who left when Diane was 9, never to be heard from again. She had, essentially, raised herself, the way she then largely left me to raise myself, not out of malice but because it was the only template she'd ever been handed. You cannot give a child a version of love you were never shown yourself, not without extraordinary effort, and my mother, exhausted and underpaid and doing the actual math of survival every single month, didn't have extraordinary effort left over most days. She told me once, during a rare quiet evening this summer before my senior year, about the one time her own mother had shown up for something, a school play, the only one in 11 years of schooling. I remember it so clearly, she said, staring into her coffee like the memory lived at the bottom of the cup. I looked out at the audience mid-scene and saw her in the 3rd row, and I was so happy I forgot my next line entirely. And then 2 weeks later she was gone, and somehow that one good memory made the leaving worse, not better, because now I knew exactly what I was missing. Is that why you never came? I asked, more gently than I might have a year before. Because you were scared of what it would mean if you showed up and then still somehow left me anyway? She looked at me for a long moment, something raw moving behind her eyes. I've never put it in those words before, she said quietly. But maybe some part of me thought if I never fully showed up, it would hurt less when I inevitably failed you the way she failed me. You didn't leave, though, I said. You were just never there. That's its own kind of leaving, Mom. Just a slower one. That doesn't erase the empty chairs. I want to be careful here, because understanding someone's reasons is not the same as saying the hurt they caused doesn't count. It counted. It counts still, in ways that shaped who I became, the girl who learned not to need anyone, the girl who was startled, genuinely startled, by an adult who showed up consistently and without being asked. But there is a version of this story where my mother is simply the villain, and that version isn't true, and I think it matters that I say so. There was a night, my senior year, when I came home from a Model UN conference, another event Mrs. Frost had driven 3 hours to attend, sitting through 6 hours of teenagers debating fictional international crises with the same rapt attention she'd have given a Broadway show, and found my mother sitting at the kitchen table, not asleep, waiting for me. How did it go? She asked. We won, I said, still surprised by the question, by the waiting. I wanted to come, she said, quietly, not quite meeting my eyes. I keep meaning to come to things. And then the shift schedule comes out, or someone calls in sick and I'm the only one who can cover, and it keeps not happening. I don't know how to explain it in a way that doesn't sound like an excuse, because I think it probably is one, at least partly. I'm scared, Piper, that I've already lost my chance to be the parent who shows up. I think that scares me so much that it's easier to just not try than to try and still not make it. It was the most honest thing my mother had ever said to me. I didn't fully forgive her that night. Forgiveness, I'd learned later from watching Mrs. Frost model something like grace for years, isn't usually a single conversation. But something in me softened, slightly, toward the frightened, exhausted woman across the table, even as I held on to the truth of everything her absence had cost me. You could still try, I said. Graduation's in 6 months. She nodded, and something passed between us that wasn't quite a promise but was more than nothing. Just after winter break of senior year, my mother lost her job at the dry cleaners. The store closed suddenly, a casualty of a larger chain moving in 2 blocks over, and for a few frightening weeks, our small, precarious household economy tipped even further off balance. I remember coming home from school to find her at the kitchen table surrounded by bills, her face gray with a particular kind of exhaustion that had nothing to do with physical tiredness. "We'll figure it out," she said, more to herself than to me, when she noticed me standing in the doorway. I always figure it out. I felt, in that moment, an old and complicated tangle of feelings, anger at years of absence, yes, but also a startling, unwanted tenderness at the sight of her looking so frightened, so much smaller than the version of her I'd built up in my head as simply careless, simply unavailable. "Let me help," I said. "I can pick up shifts somewhere." "I can, no," she said, sharper than she meant to, and then, softer, "No, Piper. You are not giving up your last semester of high school to bail out my mistakes. I will figure this out. That's my job, not yours." She found a new position within 3 weeks, at a smaller shop with worse hours but slightly better pay, and something in her seemed to shift after that scare, a new, fragile determination to not let money be the excuse anymore, even when money remained, in truth, an enormous and constant pressure. It was Mrs. Frost, in that same stretch of weeks, who quietly noticed I'd started skipping lunch and asked, with her usual directness, what was going on. "My mom lost her job," I admitted. "It's fine. We're fine." "Are you skipping lunch because you're not hungry?" she asked, "or because you're saving your lunch money for something else?" I didn't answer right away, which was answer enough. The next day, and every day after for the rest of that semester, Mrs. Frost began accidentally bringing too much lunch and asking if I wanted to help her finish it, a fiction we both maintained with the careful tenderness of 2 people who understood exactly what was actually happening and chose, wordlessly, not to name it. "You don't have to do this," I told her once, echoing, without meaning to, the exact words I'd once said about the soup she'd brought when I was sick. "I know," she said, smiling. "That's rather the point, Piper." By the time senior year arrived in full, I had grown into someone I'd barely recognized from the 6-year-old scanning an empty room for a face that wasn't there. I was editor of the school newspaper. I'd been accepted, with a substantial scholarship, into a well-regarded university 2 states away, a scholarship that existed, in no small part, because Mrs. Frost had spent an entire Saturday helping me revise my application essay, line by line, at her kitchen table, over tea that went cold twice because we kept forgetting to drink it. "This sentence," she said, tapping the page with her pen, "is good, but it's hiding something. What are you actually trying to say here?" I looked at the paragraph, something vague and safe about resilience, and admitted, "I'm trying to say that I basically raised myself, but that feels like something you're not supposed to put in a college essay." "Why not?" Mrs. Frost said. "It's the truest thing you've written today." "Write that." Write it honestly. Colleges don't want a perfect child. They want a real one. I rewrote the essay that afternoon, telling the actual truth for the first time, about empty chairs, about learning not to hope, about the teacher who started showing up when no one else did and taught me, slowly, that being alone in a room full of parents didn't mean I was unworthy of being seen. I got into that university on the strength of that essay, or so the admissions letters specific praise suggested. Mrs. Frost cried when I showed her the acceptance, right there at her kitchen table, unashamed, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "I am so incredibly proud of you," she said. "I hope you know that." There was a scholarship interview a few weeks later, a formal affair in a downtown office building with a panel of 3 serious adults asking careful questions about my goals and character. Mrs. Frost drove me there herself, since my mother had a shift she couldn't move, and sat in the waiting room the entire time, later telling me she'd said a small, silent prayer for me before I walked in, despite not being, in her words, a particularly religious woman most days. How did I do? I asked her afterward, still shaking slightly from adrenaline. "You were magnificent," she said. "Though I may be biased. I got the scholarship." When the letter arrived, my mother, reading it over my shoulder at the kitchen table, made a sound I'd never heard her make before, something between a laugh and a sob, and hugged me so tightly I nearly lost my breath. "I know I don't get to take much credit for this," she said, into my hair. "But I am so proud of you, Piper. So proud." My relationship with my mother, meanwhile, was undergoing its own slow, uneven repair. She started, in small ways, trying. She came to my last swim meet of the fall season, sitting awkwardly in the bleachers in her work clothes because she'd come straight from a shift, and I remember touching the water at the wall after my race and looking up instinctively, out of decades of habit, expecting the empty seat, and finding her there instead, waving both arms over her head like an idiot, grinning. It wasn't enough to undo 12 years. But it was something, and I was learning, mostly from watching Mrs. Frost, that something mattered, that repair didn't require erasing the past to be real. There was a harder night, too, close to Christmas, when my mother and I finally had the conversation that had been circling us for years, unspoken, at the edges of every interaction. "I know I wasn't there," she said, sitting across from me at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug of tea she wasn't drinking. "For most of it. I know that. I've watched you build a whole life with people who aren't me standing in the audience, and some days that feels like exactly what I deserve, and other days it breaks my heart in a way I don't have words for. I needed you," I said, and my voice cracked on it. All these years later, the wound apparently not as scarred over as I'd assumed. Not money on the counter. Not permission slips signed at 11 at night. I needed you in the room. "I know," she said. "I'm sorry." I don't think sorry undoes 12 years of empty chairs. But I am sorry, Piper. More than I've ever known how to say. It was the first time she'd said it plainly, without qualification, without immediately defending herself in the same breath. I sat with that apology for a long time, turning it over, testing its weight, the way Mrs. Frost had once taught me to test the weight of any honest sentence. "I believe you," I finally said. "I don't know if I forgive all of it yet. But I believe that you mean it." "That's fair," she said. "That's more than fair." Spring arrived, and with it, the countdown to graduation, the biggest empty chair test of my entire childhood, looming now not as a hypothetical but as an actual date circled on the school calendar. I found myself, in the weeks leading up to it, oddly terrified. Not of the ceremony itself, not of walking across the stage, but of the specific, familiar act of scanning a crowd for a face and finding, once again, an absence where a presence should be. 12 years of practice had taught me how to survive that particular disappointment, but survival and hope for something better are not the same thing, and some stubborn part of me still hoped. Mrs. Frost, of course, would be there. She'd told me as much months in advance, unprompted, the way she always did now, having long ago earned the right to be counted on without me having to ask. I wouldn't miss it, she said, one Thursday afternoon in the newspaper office, where I was finishing my last issue as editor. Not for anything. You've been to everything for 4 years, I said. You don't have to keep proving it. I'm not proving anything, she said, smiling. I just genuinely want to be there. There's a difference, Piper, between obligation and wanting. I hope you can feel that difference by now. I could. That was, perhaps, the largest single thing she'd taught me over 4 years, not any specific lesson about essays or grammar or how to structure an argument, but the felt, bodily difference between someone showing up because they had to and someone showing up because they chose to, again and again, with no external requirement forcing their hand. My mother, for her part, asked about graduation with a new, careful attentiveness that still occasionally startled me. What time does it start? Do I need tickets? How many can I bring? Just you, I said. If you can make it. I'm taking the day off, she said. I already asked. I told my manager it's non-negotiable. I wanted to believe her completely. Some old, well-worn part of me held back, bracing itself the way you brace for a door that has slammed shut in the same spot 100 times before. But there was also a newer part of me, one Mrs. Frost had helped build slowly over 4 years, that let a small, cautious hope in anyway. The week before graduation, Mrs. Frost took me to lunch, just the two of us, at a small diner near the school where we'd gone a handful of times over the years to celebrate things, a good grade, an accepted article, a scholarship offer. I want you to know something, she said, over coffee neither of us had touched. Whatever happens with your mother on graduation day, whether she's there on time, or late, or not at all, though I do hope it's one of the first two, I need you to understand that you have already, entirely on your own merit, become someone I am endlessly proud to know. That was true before this week, and it will remain true no matter what happens next Saturday. Why do you always know exactly what I need to hear? I asked, half laughing, half crying. Practice, she said. For years of very deliberate practice, paying attention to a remarkable young woman who deserved far more attention than she was getting elsewhere. Graduation morning arrived bright and a little too warm, the kind of early summer day that makes everyone squint and fan themselves with the paper programs handed out at the door. I stood backstage in my cap and gown, lined up alphabetically with 300 other students, my stomach a tight knot of nerves that had less to do with the ceremony itself and everything to do with the audience waiting beyond the curtain. My mother texted me that morning, on my way. Wouldn't miss this for the world. So proud of you already. I read it 3 times, trying to decide how much to let myself believe it. Mrs. Frost found me backstage before the ceremony began, slipping past a harried assistant principal with the easy confidence of someone who'd earned the right to be exactly where she wanted to be. She was wearing a deep blue dress I'd never seen before, her silver hair pinned up, a small corsage pinned to her chest that I later learned she'd bought herself, for the occasion, because some days deserve flowers. You look terrified, she said, smiling. I am, I admitted. Of the speech, or of the seats? I laughed, a little wetly. You know me too well. Whatever happens out there, she said, taking both my hands in hers, you have already become someone extraordinary, Piper. That happened regardless of who's sitting in that audience. I need you to walk out there today knowing that, whatever chairs are empty or full. I nodded, not quite trusting my voice, and she squeezed my hands once before disappearing back through the curtain to find her seat. The ceremony unfolded the way these things always do, a procession of speeches from the principal and the valedictorian, the slow alphabetical march of 300 names, families cheering unevenly across the auditorium in bursts that rose and fell like uneven weather. I sat near the middle of the alphabet, close enough to the stage to watch each student's walk, far enough to have plenty of time to scan the crowd, again and again, for my mother's face. I found her, eventually, about 20 minutes into the ceremony. She'd arrived late, breathless, sliding into a seat near the back that a stranger had kindly shifted over to make room for. She caught my eye across the auditorium and waved, small and a little embarrassed, mouthing sorry, traffic. She was there. Late, but there. I felt something in my chest loosen slightly, and not untying itself after 12 years pulled taut. When my name was finally called, Piper Hayes, I stood and walked across that stage the way I'd walked across dozens of stages before, in front of dozens of half-empty crowds, except this time was different in a way I could feel in my whole body. I shook the principal's hand. I took my diploma. And as I turned to face the crowd, out of old habit, I scanned the rows for a familiar face. I found two. My mother was on her feet, clapping, her mascara already running, mouthing my name like she wanted the whole auditorium to hear it even though her voice couldn't carry that far. And a few rows ahead of her, Mrs. Frost was standing too, clapping harder and louder than anyone else in that entire auditorium, an unrestrained, joyful noise that cut clean through the general applause the way a single trumpet cuts through an orchestra. She wasn't clapping politely, the way strangers clap for a name they don't recognize. She was clapping the way you clap when you have watched someone build themselves, brick by brick, out of very little, and you understand exactly what that diploma actually cost. I don't think I imagined it. I've asked others who were there, and they've confirmed it, laughing, that Mrs. Frost's applause was, without question, the loudest sound in that entire auditorium when my name was called. Louder than my mother's. Louder than the polite scattered claps of relatives I'd never met, there for other students. A single, unmistakable, joyful noise, for years and hundreds of empty chairs in the making. I walked off that stage with tears streaming freely down my face, not bothering to hide them, because for the first time in 12 years, I understood something with total, bone-deep clarity. The sound of being truly seen doesn't always come from the person whose job it was to see you. Sometimes it comes from the person who simply chose to, over and over, long after they had any obligation to keep choosing. The reception afterward was a chaotic swirl of families finding each other in the crowded courtyard, cameras flashing, students still in their gowns hugging friends they wouldn't see again until winter break, if ever. My mother found me first, wrapping me in a hug that smelled like the perfume she rarely wore, the good kind, saved for occasions. "I'm so proud of you," she said, into my shoulder. I know I don't have the right to say that as much as I'd like to. But I am. I am so proud of who you became. You made it, I said. You were late, but you made it. I'll take late, she said, pulling back to look at me, her eyes still wet. Late is better than never. I know I owe you a lot more than just showing up to one graduation. I'm going to keep trying, Piper. For as long as you'll let me. Okay, I said, and meant it. Not full forgiveness, not yet, not entirely, but a door left open, which was more than I'd have offered a year earlier, and more, I suspected, than my mother had expected to be given. Mrs. Frost found us a few minutes later, holding a small wrapped gift she pressed into my hands before I could protest. I know families are supposed to give the graduation gifts, she said, a little awkwardly, glancing at my mother as if seeking silent permission. I hope this isn't overstepping. My mother, to her enormous credit, shook her head immediately. It's not overstepping at all, she said, and there was something genuine in it, something that had clearly cost her some real effort to arrive at. Thank you for everything you did for her. I mean that. I know I wasn't the one showing up most of these years. I'm grateful someone was. It was, I think, the single most generous thing I ever heard my mother say, and I watched Mrs. Frost's eyes fill with tears at the sound of it. The two women stood together for a moment, an unlikely pair bound only by their shared love for the same girl, and then, unexpectedly, my mother reached out and hugged Mrs. Frost too, a brief, slightly awkward embrace between two women who had spent years as unspoken rivals for the same small, precious territory, finally choosing, in that courtyard, to be something more like allies instead. Thank you, my mother said again, quietly, into Mrs. Frost's shoulder. For not letting her go unseen. I don't think I could have forgiven myself if she'd had no one. She was never going to have no one, Mrs. Frost said. She's far too remarkable for that. I opened the gift right there in the courtyard, a leather journal, soft and well-made, with my initials embossed in the corner, and tucked inside the front cover, a card in Mrs. Frost's familiar looping handwriting. Piper, you once wrote an essay about empty chairs that broke my heart and rearranged it at the same time. I hope you fill every page of this journal with your own true sentences, the way you did that first Thursday 4 years ago. Whatever you write next, in college and beyond, I will be in the audience, clapping, for as long as I'm able. You taught me something too, these 4 years, that showing up for someone isn't a burden. It's one of the great privileges of being alive. Congratulations, my dear girl. Eleanor, I read it twice, then folded it carefully back into the journal's cover, a keepsake I still have today, worn soft at the corners from years of handling. I've had a long time now to think about that graduation day, about the two women standing and clapping for me across that crowded auditorium, one who owed me the applause by blood and one who gave it freely, by choice, for 4 unbroken years. I don't think this is a story about choosing one over the other. My mother and I are still working on our relationship, all these years later. It isn't fixed, not fully, maybe not ever fully, but it's better than it was, built slowly on small honest moments instead of grand gestures, the way most real repair actually happens. She came to my college graduation 4 years later too, on time that time, sitting in the second row, and when I found her face in the crowd, I didn't feel the old flinch of expecting absence. I felt, instead, something like relief, proof that people really can change, slowly, imperfectly, if they keep choosing to try. Mrs. Frost was there too, of course, in the row just behind my mother, having driven 6 hours for the occasion, and when my name was called for the second time in my life, I heard, once again, unmistakably, her voice rising above the crowd. But Mrs. Frost taught me something my mother, through no fault entirely her own, simply didn't have the capacity to teach me during those early years, that family isn't only the people who share your blood or your last name. Sometimes it's the person who sits in the empty chair when no one else will. Sometimes it's the teacher who notices a lonely kid's writing and decides, deliberately, to keep showing up, Thursday after Thursday, event after event, long after any professional obligation would have released her from the task. Family, I've come to believe, is built less by biology and more by attention, by the accumulated weight of 1,000 small choices to show up, to notice, to stay. My mother is learning that lesson late, and imperfectly, and I love her for trying even now. Mrs. Frost knew it instinctively, and gave it freely, and asked for nothing in return except, perhaps, The quiet privilege of watching someone become who they were always capable of becoming. I keep that journal on my desk now, years later, half filled with my own true sentences the way she hoped it would be. And on the wall above it, I keep a photograph from that graduation day, not the official one, taken on stage with the principal, but one a classmate's parents snapped from the audience, capturing the exact moment I turned to face the crowd after receiving my diploma. In it, you can see my mother, standing, clapping, mascara already smudged. And a few rows ahead of her, arms raised high, mouth open in an unrestrained shout of joy, is Mrs. Eleanor Frost, not my mother, not my blood, but unmistakably, undeniably, family. Some rooms teach you to expect an empty chair. Other rooms teach you that the chair was never really empty at all. It was just waiting for the right person to understand that showing up isn't an obligation. It's a gift you choose to give, again and again, to someone worth the giving. I was worth it. It took me 18 years and one extraordinary teacher to fully believe that. But I believe it now, all the way down, the way you believe the truest sentences, the ones you finally learn to write for yourself. 10 years after that graduation day, I sat down one evening in my own apartment, in a city 3,000 miles from the one where I grew up, and wrote Mrs. Frost a letter I'd been composing in my head for over a decade. By then I had become a writer myself, not the career either of us had explicitly imagined for me back in that 8th grade classroom, but one that grew, in a straight and unbroken line, from every Thursday afternoon she'd spent teaching a lonely, guarded girl that her own true sentences were worth writing down. My first book, a memoir about growing up with an absent mother and a mentor who filled the gap without ever pretending to erase it, had just been published, and the first copy off the press sat on my desk, its cover still smelling faintly of fresh ink. I wrote to her about all of it, about how often, sitting at my laptop at 2 in the morning trying to find the right words for a difficult chapter, I heard her voice in my head asking, "What are you actually trying to say here?" About how the dedication page of that book read simply, "For my mother, who learned, and for Eleanor, who never had to." About how strange and wonderful it was that the sentence I'd once been too frightened to write in a Thursday writing group, "I looked for my mother and didn't find her," had become, eventually, the opening line of a book that people all over the country were now reading in their own kitchens, recognizing, in the particular way readers do, some version of their own empty chairs. She wrote back within the week, her handwriting a little shakier now than it had been in that classroom 15 years earlier, but the voice underneath it exactly the same. "Piper, I have read your book twice already, and I expect I will read it many more times before I am through with this life. I want you to know that the proudest moment of my entire career was not any of the 400 students I taught over 31 years. It was watching one particular girl walk across a stage, look out at a crowd she'd spent a childhood learning not to trust, and find, at last, that she was worth showing up for. You did not need me to become who you became. You simply needed someone to notice what was already there. I am so grateful it was allowed to be me." I keep that letter, along with the journal from graduation day, in the same drawer of my desk, a small archive of the two objects that taught me, more than anything else, what it means to be truly seen. My mother and I speak every week now, sometimes for an hour at a time, conversations that would have been unthinkable during the years of empty chairs. She has read my book too, several times, she tells me, though she admits some chapters are harder for her than others. "I keep wanting to go back and fix it," she told me once, over the phone, her voice thick. "Every empty chair. I know I can't. But I wish, more than almost anything else in my life, that I could." "You showed up for the ones that mattered most, eventually," I told her. "The scholarship interview waiting room, even though you weren't inside it. The swim meet. The graduation, even late. You're showing up now, every single week, on this phone, listening to me talk about nothing in particular for an hour at a time. That counts too, Mom. It always counted, even when it felt small. Does it, though? She asked. Really? It does, I said. I promise you it does. Mrs. Frost passed away 2 years after that letter, peacefully, in her sleep, at the age of 71. I flew home for the funeral and stood at the front of a small, crowded church, delivering a eulogy I had rewritten 7 times in the week beforehand, trying, one last time, to find sentences worthy of everything she'd given me. There is a kind of love, I told the room, that asks for nothing in return except the privilege of witnessing someone become who they were always capable of becoming. I was given that kind of love by a woman who owed me nothing, who chose me anyway, over and over, for 30 years, without ever once making me feel like a burden for needing her. I do not have words large enough for what that gift was worth. I have only my whole life, built in no small part on the foundation she gave me, and I intend to spend the rest of it trying to be, for someone else, exactly what she was for me. After the service, in the church parking lot, my mother found me and held me for a long time without saying anything at all. When she finally spoke, it was simply this: "Thank you for letting me be part of this too," at the end. I know I came to the party late. I'm grateful you saved me a seat anyway. You're my mother, I said. There was always a seat waiting for you. It just took us both a long time to learn how to fill it. I think about that often now, how 2 very different women, in 2 very different ways, taught me the same essential truth, that love is not a single grand gesture, but 1,000 small choices to show up, again and again, for as long as you're given the chance. My mother learned it late, imperfectly, and kept trying anyway. Mrs. Frost knew it from the start, and gave it freely, and asked for nothing but the chance to watch me grow. Both kinds of love built me. Both kinds, in their own way, taught me what it means to finally, fully, believe that I was always worth showing up for. Not every hero wears a cape. Sometimes they're a teacher who notices the quiet student, a neighbor who takes the time to care, or someone who simply keeps showing up when everyone else walks away. Piper's journey reminds us that one caring person can change an entire life. If this story touched your heart, tell us in the comments, who was the person that never gave up on you? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more emotional family stories every week. Thank you for watching, and remember, you deserve to be seen, heard, and celebrated.